I think, on balance, Brexit has been a significant success for this country.
Except it hasn't.
The Centre for Economic Reform claims the government has lost out on £40 billion in taxes because of the damage done to the country's output by leaving the European Union.
The Centre for European Reform has modelled the economic performance of a UK that remained in the EU, using data from countries whose performance was similar to ours before Brexit. It then compared this with the real performance of the UK economy since the referendum 6 years ago. The analysis concludes that between April and June this year, our economy was 5.5% smaller than it would have been had we stayed in the EU. And in the year to June, lower growth cost the government around £40 billion in lost tax revenue. In a statement, a Treasury spokesman said, "We do not recognise this analysis. We are taking full advantage of the opportunities of Brexit."
In fact, 6 years on from the UK's decision to leave the European Union, Brexit is still proving the biggest headache for British businesses, ranking even higher than Russia's war in Ukraine, COVID or rising energy costs.
Brexit, without doubt, has made us poorer than we otherwise would have done.
So there is an effect, and that's why I'm saying yes, there is an effect.
The UK economy as a whole has been permanently damaged by Brexit. It's reduced the economy's potential output significantly, eroded business investment. I mean, look, if we hadn't had Brexit, we probably wouldn't be talking about an austerity budget this week. The need for tax rises, spending cuts wouldn't be there if Brexit hadn't reduced the economy's potential output so much.
So much for this.
We could have cheaper food, clothing and footwear straight away by getting rid of the protectionist anti-trade tariffs that the EU imposes.
In fact, almost 2 years after Britain left the EU, Brexit has actually made households poorer, adding almost £6 billion to Britain's food bills over a 2-year period. And it's the households with least that have been affected most. But instead of acknowledging this, the government has chosen to engage in a shameless campaign of misinformation. We've secured new trade deals with over 70 countries since 2016. That's over £800 billion worth of new global trade, the Conservative Party has triumphantly tweeted. This tweet, shared by members of the government, has been slammed by the official statistics watchdog. Most of these deals were simply rolled over from existing EU agreements following Brexit. The figure refers to the total value of trade between the UK and countries it has agreed trade deals with, not the value that they add. So saying these trade deals are worth over £800 billion in new global trade is just complete bollocks. Yes, we've done some new trade deals, for instance with Australia, and on that listen to the former Environment Secretary George Eustace addressing the House of Commons on November 14th.
I was in the Cabinet in 2021, and I was in this Cabinet subcommittee that argued over the Australian trade deal. For yes, there were deep arguments and differences over how we should approach this. But since I now enjoy the freedom of the backbenches, I no longer have to put such a positive gloss on what was agreed. The first step is to recognise that the Australia trade deal is not actually a very good deal for the UK. The truth of the matter is that the UK gave away far too much for far too little in return.
We lose 4% of our GDP by Brexit. We gain 0.08% by the government's own estimate through this trade deal with Australia.
And then there's the trade deal with New Zealand.
British farmers have reacted with shock to the terms of a new free trade deal with New Zealand.
The deal will see Kiwi meat imported without tariffs, and farmers in the UK say they get nothing in return.
A world away from rejoicing Kiwi farmers, their welly-wearing counterparts feel as though they are the sacrificial lambs of the free trade deal.
We're not competing on a level playing field. It's us surrendering to you, New Zealanders, and giving you a great deal, and we're getting nothing out of it.
The impact on Britain's economy is expected to be negligible.
And who could forget this gem?
And there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade.
It was completely untrue. What we got was this.
But the truth is that Boris Johnson promised the deal that you signed would, and I quote, if anything, allow our companies and our exporters to do even more business with our European friends. And the truth is that because of all sorts of new paperwork, there are now 20-page export health certificates for vets, there's 27-page catch certificates for exporting fish, there's duties for goods of all kinds which don't meet rules of origin requirements. And if that is going to make trading with business with Europe harder and harder and harder, then the common sense conclusion is that people will do less of it.
Desperate for a tangible benefit of Brexit, the government is now resorting to telling the public things like this.
Just remember one thing, Mr. Speaker. We had the fastest vaccine rollout in the world. We had that because of our freedoms after leaving the European Union.
It's completely untrue, long since debunked and previously spouted by former Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Is the UK better off than it was 6 years ago when you left the EU?
It is, and we've got, look, what we've been able to do. Let me give you an example. Thanks to the position that we took, we had an independent medical agency that was able to make sure that the first COVID vaccine in anybody's, first approved COVID vaccine in anybody's arms in the world was in the UK. We then had the fastest vaccine, and that was because we were outside something called the European Medicines Agency.
Even worse, the Prime Minister is now sending out members of his government to repeat it.
We wouldn't have had the vaccine rollout that was so successful if we'd been within the European Union.
Britain was still bound by EMA rules when the COVID vaccination programme began, and they all know it. Don't just take my word for it, listen to the head of the MHRA, June Rain.
We appear to be getting authorisation for this vaccine ahead of our friends in Europe. I was just wondering, does the fact that the UK is no longer part of the EU, did that make any difference to the speed with which you were able to complete your authorisation?
We have been able to authorise the supply of this vaccine using provisions under European law which exist until the 1st of January.
EU legislation enacted into British law already allowed countries to temporarily authorise vaccines without waiting for approval from the EMA. In fact, the UK government always made it clear that it could authorise vaccines unilaterally under European law.
So you couldn't have done it if otherwise?
Okay. Yes.
It's absolutely shameless, and if you think that's bad,
take back control of huge sums of money, £350 million a week, and spend it on our priorities, such as the NHS.
It was, of course, also completely untrue.
You're wandering around this country with a dirty great lie on the side of your bus.
The government is now shamelessly conning the public into believing the NHS has already been given the promised Brexit dividend of an extra £350 million a week.
And that money is now in the NHS. This is the point. Theresa May unleashed a record funding settlement.
The NHS already had the £350 million on the side of the bus. That was delivered by my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, in 2018, with an extra £34 billion uplift to the NHS by 2023-24.
It's absolutely shocking and completely untrue. The £34 billion of NHS funding originally announced by Theresa May has absolutely nothing to do with Brexit, and they all know it. In real terms, it was just £20.5 billion as it's over 5 years. That's less than £5 billion a year. The Institute for Fiscal Studies points out that's less than funding used to rise under Labour. The promised £350 million a week is over £18 billion a year, and that's every year. Meanwhile, the government continues to hide facts from the public like this.
We see the UK pretty close to the bottom of the league table in terms of the forecast for economic growth, particularly in 2023. So the UK essentially sees no growth at all, and the only country that was worse than the UK was sanctioned Russia.
The OBR report the government is relying on says Brexit will result in the UK's trade intensity being a staggering 15% lower in the long run than if the UK had remained in the EU. It says latest evidence suggests Brexit has had a significant adverse impact on UK trade, reducing both overall trade volumes and the number of trading relationships between UK and EU firms. The UK is the only economy in the G7 which is shrinking at the moment, with the hard Brexit championed by the Prime Minister contributing to UK trade performance falling to its worst level on record and business investment trailing other industrialised countries. So have there been any actual tangible benefits of Brexit?
The last couple of minutes together, there are benefits to be had from Brexit, are there, Lord Spence?
Yes, many.
Outline some that we need to explore.
Well,
now.
Why don't, for example, financial services? One of them, which again will of course not poll well, is would you take away the cap on bankers' bonuses?
Well, surprise, surprise, that's one benefit of Brexit the government has actually delivered.